a seat. Yeah. So like when you go to an event, and there's always that one guy with a phone that's just beeping. We can hear you, and it annoys everybody. So let's not be that guy today. I'll make sure. Yeah. So we've got a program where we're just going to be asking Mark a lot of questions, because they're obviously doing a lot of interesting stuff. And then at the end, you guys also have the opportunity to ask any questions. At the back, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
Should I speak lower or a bit higher? Fine.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm. All right. So Mark, welcome to Zazu.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being a guest today.
Thank you very much.
Maybe you can introduce yourself to everybody, who you are, what you do at Mastercard, how you became to be there, really.
Okay, cool. So, hi everybody. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. So, my name's Mark, and I look after Mastercard for Southern Africa, which is basically SADC. So, we have Vincent, who's the country manager for Malawi and Zambia, also with me this evening, which is very nice. So, if I have any difficult questions, you know where they're going. And so, yeah, I based myself in South Africa, and I've been there now for about 5 years, and we're obviously on a bit of a drive for a lot of different initiatives in Mastercard. But we used to be known as a credit card company. Clearly, we're anything but a credit card company. We're not a bank, right? And beyond the obvious products, we do a lot of services now as well. We also have a really interesting drive into things like financial inclusion, and so we can talk about that if you want to talk about that. And then also we're really building out our services business as part of becoming a technology company. So we're on that journey, and it's taking us into a lot of different avenues. We continue to acquire a lot of companies. Every day I wake up and I open my emails, I find we've acquired another company, and it's just because we continue to try and improve what we can bring and what we can integrate into our network, because ultimately if you continue to optimize the network, then everybody benefits from that, right? So it's a really interesting strategy. It's very broad, and happy to try and deal with Perseus's very prepared questions and my very prepared answers.
No, so you say you're not a credit card company.
Yes.
If you had to explain it to the uninitiated, what is Mastercard?
Okay, so very simply, when you walk into a merchant and you look to buy something, there's a moment of trust. The moment of trust is because you hand over something, or you use a phone or something, and then the merchant lets you leave his shop or whatever with an item. So in actual fact, that's kind of weird, right? So it's that moment of trust which has been created. So that's what we create. We create that moment of trust.
Let's go one level deeper. Okay, so there's a moment of trust, which is what you're creating, and you don't give people credit cards. How do you create that moment of trust? Is it with the end consumers? Is it with the merchants? How do you actually facilitate that?
Sure. So we have a network, which I guess is our goal, right? And so that sits in St. Louis in America. And that network is effectively linking up 35 million ATMs, millions of point of sale, and over 28,000 banks. So and the speed of a transaction, I mean, I don't know if you know, but a point of sale transaction will time out after 16 seconds, right? So things have to be done relatively quickly. What you also have to imagine is that as those messages are being passed around that network, we can actually enhance the quality of that message so additional services can be led. So for example, if as a bank you are having customers who are doing specific types of transactions, but you're not sure how to improve the score that you're getting and whether to approve that transaction, we can layer services into that message exchange between the different parties, so that the data on that particular customer gets fed back to the bank, so that based on the data, they can optimize the score. Right? that all happens in real time. So the network's a pretty amazing thing. I was actually saying to Perseus the other day that our uptime is something like 99.69%, which basically means our entire Mastercard network is down every year for 5.5 minutes in total. Okay, that's actually incredible if you think about the different connections to be only down for 5.5 minutes. What that means is that you can't rely on humans to fix stuff. So it's all automated, it's all AI, it's all this kind of stuff. So it's a pretty incredible network. The question is, how do you continue to optimize it, and where do you take it? And I can give you examples if you're interested.
So one thing that we have seen that's been happening over the last maybe 10 to 15 years is that people like the government of Zambia who say, let's create our own national financial switch. To you as Mastercard, what do you think the benefits are to the end user, the cardholder, and is there any impact on this network that you're talking about from Mastercard?
Okay, we might need to get there more slowly. So let's take it in bite-sized chunks, right? So I think there's a global phenomenon which is driven for lots of different reasons around nationalization, right? And that's due to things like state actors who creates concern as we become more polarized in the global ecosystem. So what happens is governments look at how they kind of protect their own interests, and so ideas like domestic switches come up. The challenge with that is that when you create a domestic switch, I don't know if you are interested in what that means from a payments perspective, but I'll explain. What it means from a payments perspective is that transaction no longer gets routed through Mastercard, right? So what that means is that transaction actually doesn't come across those rails I just spoke about. So the implication of that is that you're then relying on somebody else to perform the role that we were previously providing, right? What does that mean? Well, what that means is that all that money that we're spending on things like fraud solutions and all this kind of stuff, you're no longer availing that type of stuff. So if you think about what's really important in the way that is happening in payments is you've got some global stuff going on, and then you have to figure out how's that global stuff going to contextualize itself in Zambia, right? So let's talk about some of the global stuff that's going on. Apple Pay. So Apple Pay decided about 3 years ago that they were going to ride on the Mastercard rails, right? Which was kind of a little bit of relief. But what that meant is that when you pull out your phone and you have that moment of trust at the merchant, there's a tokenization that goes on between the phone and the point of sale terminal. Right? And that tokenization is basically encrypting your credentials to make sure everything stays safe and secure. So Apple Pay continued to go on that, and so they're availing those tokenization standards. So what's important to understand is, okay, so how's that going to manifest itself over time in Zambia? So what you could say is, well, the starting point is we just need to get payments going because still 99% of payments is cash. But over time, what you'll see is Pick and Pay will start to do things like contactless payments. And so then you'll be pulling out your card and you'll be tapping it on the point of sale, and you'll start to get that customer habit going on about habitually when I do something, faster multi-lane checkout, better customer experience, and everybody's happy, everybody's good. The next step
at that point, the Zazu cards are contactless. Yes, just for the record.
I should have done that plug for you. I'm learning. So then the next step is that, right? So then the question is, when you've got a domestic switch, do they, based on the software provider that they have, the operating team that comes along, are they going to be able to build the right type of tokenization standards? How are they going to handle those things? Can they handle e-commerce? Do they understand gateways? Do they understand fraud solutions? So, to your question, which you actually asked about 15 minutes ago, what's in it for the end consumer? Not as much.
Okay.
It could be better.
Thank you. So what, are we safe using Mastercards? What are you saying then?
So what I'm saying is that what we need to do is we need to have very open conversations with whoever comes through on the domestic switch. And we need to say to them, are you set up for success? Do you understand this? Do you understand that? And can we collaborate? So I think that's where we want to take the dialogue. We're a very collaborative organization.
Okay.
And so what I always say to conferences that we hold wherever, we always have lots of different people in the room. And so there's fintechs, there's FI, there's retailers, telcos, everybody's there.
And we've seen you in the last few years, especially in Zambia, where you've been partnering with people like Zazu, with Natse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're very collaborative, and ultimately we want to make things work. So what we would say then is this domestic switch situation, is it possible, for example, to do call-outs? Now, call-out basically is where you say in real time, can you do a call-out to Mastercard so that they can do the tokenization standard for example? And so that's what we have to do. We have to think about how can we collaborate, how can we ensure that you get the best of breed so that ultimately you don't get cut off from a global ecosystem, which, let's face it, is moving pretty quickly. That's really important because if you think about people like the Facebooks, the big digital platforms who've got massive consumers, we want to make sure that the technology keeps thriving here in Zambia and it stays current. Because ultimately what you don't want is you don't want those guys coming in and cannibalizing everybody's business.
So what Facebook are going to be looking for is going to be different to what people perhaps in this room or the fintechs that are just starting out are looking for. Earlier you spoke about financial inclusion. What kind of things are you doing to spearhead that as the main person of Mastercard in Southern Africa?
So I think the challenge, if you think about financial inclusion, is obviously on both sides of the equation. So one side of the equation is how do we bring more financial consumers into the financial ecosystem? And there's a ladder that we think through of what that means. So first of all, having an identity, and then being able to actually have an account where one can utilize it, and then how do you actually broaden your relationship? So that's one side of it. The other side of it is how do you create a more inclusive acceptance landscape? And so what that obviously also means is how do we make it cheaper? So I suppose the thought process that we think through is we think through both sides of the equation, and at the end of the day there has to be a store of value in the middle. And so what's really interesting is to think through how can we change the economics so that because there's a lot of people involved, right? As you know, there's a lot of people involved. So how can we change the economics by potentially looking at different types of transaction types? How can we think about reducing the costs of terminalization? And so, I'll give you an example. A QR code is obviously a lot cheaper than a couple of $100 terminal. You can avail a sticker, which is very easy to download or make available on your mobile. That's a more inclusive way of doing things. So what then we have to do is we have to think about partners who want to really drive these type of initiatives, and that's how we collaborate. So we've got. I can talk about some examples, but principally that's how we piece it all together.
So those partners that you have, let's say they're selling QR codes. If I go to a merchant who's never heard of a QR code, what do you think their concerns are, and how do you kind of overcome that through your partners?
So I think if I'm selling tomatoes on a stall in the street, I have different ways of accepting payment, and one of them is cash, right? So cash is it's in my hand. It's easy then to recycle that to do something else pretty quickly. It's also possible to have some type of kudos within the community. So if I think about mobile money actually does compete relatively well with cash, I think, in some aspects, in terms of settlement time, right? So settlement time is not bad. But obviously there's a limitation though in some of the use cases where I can use mobile money.
The requirement to have a phone.
So then the question then is, so acknowledging that speed of consumer experience is really important, but also merchant experience is really important. What we have to do is we have to kind of understand, so how are we going to create something for the merchant that wants them to accept payment? So one thing is it has to be cheap. It has to be cheap to acquire the payment. The second thing is that I need to have access to the funds relatively quickly, right? The third thing, which is really interesting, is could I, by accepting payment, build up a data record, which ultimately then may mean that I can, through that data record, kind of create some type of credit history, which would then allow me to get a loan and build up my business, right? So that's really that's really the SME story, which is where the big opportunity is to say, how do we create that ecosystem for the SME so that they have a good experience? Let's face it, if you're selling tomatoes and you have a bad first experience, that QR code's going to go back underneath the stall, and we're going to keep on. So one bad experience or two bad experiences without the right incentives, your history.
Okay.
It's tough.
So you're talking about the opportunities for the MSMEs. You're saying that's where the broader opportunity is. If you were to start a fintech today, you don't work at Mastercard, what would you be focusing on?
Yo. Vincent. The answer to that. So it's funny, right? So my experience of fintechs is it's very varied, because sometimes it's just such a laser focus on a specific gap. And what I see is that there's some really successful fintechs which have grown their business really quickly because they've identified that banks can't get out of the way of themselves to do things. So, for example, there's a fintech in Stellenbosch called Intersect. And what these guys do is they're literally, do you know these guys? Yeah, cool.
Brilliant guys, yeah.
Yeah, they're smart guys, right? And so what they're doing is they're literally helping out with, let's put this in easy terms. So they're basically helping out with security, authentication in a mobile banking environment, right? So they just enable it quicker if you want to have a quick go-to-market and authenticating payments on mobile phones. So what they've done is they've found a very simple use case, but it's so niche. But they're just driving a train through it, right? So I'm not going to give you my idea, although I have to tell you, I do have a partiality to wellness.
Okay.
So if this is kind of like a column thing where you say, what would you be doing if you could be really dreamy? If I could be really dreamy, I'd be helping people's nutrition in lower income areas. That's something which
We're moving away from finance, so let's come back to it. Earlier you spoke that you open your emails and you see a lot of notifications about acquisitions, and 99% of the payments in Zambia are still cash. For most people who use a debit card, it's likely to be Visa here in the market.
Definitely.
Yeah. What led us to this situation? Because we're now starting to see you guys becoming more aggressive in the market. Yeah. What's the play there?
So basically, let me see if I answer your question. But basically, we were late to market, right? So Visa came around with a checkbook in the 90s, and they did everything. And then they kind of so that's fine. So now we have to kind of have a look at things, and we have to think, so if we want to be part of the Zambian setup, then how must we work differently? So we do have a little bit of a track record from our consumers about being quite innovative. And so what that means is that we try to bring innovative ideas around things like digital and digital payments. We obviously have a focus on financial inclusion and lots of different proof points around that. And so what we try to do is we're trying to approach different customers and actually it's about engagement. It's about understanding, where are you currently and how do you need to, are you kind of being attacked or are you defending? And how can we help you kind of get your digital roadmap on track? And my observation is that there's a lot of opportunity. So if you think about our strategy, actually, very simply, it's in any economy globally, 15%. So globally, 15% of payments are electronic. 85% of transactions globally is still cash. So actually, we can spend a lot of time having funny conversations about trying to beat up Visa and these type of people, but actually displacing cash is by far the most relevant thing to do. So most of our teams spend their time just cracking their heads about how to displace cash. And the way we talk about government is to say that actually that cash is costing about 1.5% of GDP. Therefore, it's something which is quite sensible to go after. And there are some amazing markets like the Nordics, places like Sweden, where they're basically cashless already. I don't know if you know, but 92% of payments in Australia are contactless payments, right? So imagine the customer's just gone there. Everything's contactless and the floor limit's relatively high. So in these markets, what we have to do is we have to think about, and that's what we have to obsess about is what are the pain points we're trying to cure for? And where are the big pools? Where are the big cash pools? So what we do at Mastercard is we actually map markets and we look at where those big cash pools are. So what I can tell you off the top of my head is that, and I should know the Zambian numbers, but in South Africa, there's 77 billion rand of bill pay, right? 77 billion rand. And we figured that 10 billion of that is easily addressable. So then the question is, what are the things you need to do to go after bill pay? Because that's got to be a huge opportunity. So we have whole teams just thinking through, how do we go after that? How do we work with government? How do we work with the institutions, fintechs?
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, because if you make it easy for people to pay their taxes, then it makes it easy for the government to be able to collect.
Correct.
Yeah. So what is Vincent doing on that front?
What are you doing, Vincent?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of work. I think the best thing that we've done is to make sure that we develop acquiring network where you can go with your card and make sure that it's accepted. So for the past 2 to 3 years, that was our major focus, to make sure that we onboard as many banks as we can. So as I speak now, you can use your Mastercard pretty much on all the bigger banks. So you talk of Zanaco, Barclays, Standard Chartered, FNB, UBA, EcoBank. So we're comfortable. We are somewhere around 80%. So that's what we've done. So now after that, we are now concentrating on issuance now. This year, you start to see a lot of Mastercard cards coming out to the market.
I think the goal, though, if you think about 3 to 5 years from now, is, and everybody can relate to this, I can relate to this, but ideally what you want to have is in your hand, you want to have the ability to be able to do lots of different things, right? But what you want to do is you want to have choice and you want to have speed of doing things. So our strategy increasingly is no longer just about card rails, but it's what we call a multi-rail strategy. So what that means is that we recently bought in the UK a company called Vocalink, who own the license to the bank rails, right? So we bought that for £900 million, and they have the bank rails. And then everybody woke up and they said,
what does that mean, the bank rails?
So that's bank-to-bank payment. So if you go home tonight and you make an EFT payment from one bank to another bank, that's the bank rail, which is different to the card rails, right?
It's an equivalent of the electronic clearing hubs in Zambia.
Yeah. Okay. So we bought that in the UK. So what we're now doing is we've taken that capability and we've taken it to South America, to Peru, we've taken it to Singapore, we've taken it to America. And we're building out regional hubs where Mastercard actually provides the banking infrastructure for instant payments. So that means instant. Back to the instant payment. Very important. What we've also done is we bought another company in the Nordics called Nets for $3.2 billion in November. And that's basically the same thing. So we're amassing this huge capability around bank-to-bank payments. So now what you see is the Mastercard strategy is about recognizing digital convergence. And as a consumer, you may want to draw down on your mobile money wallet. You may want to draw down on your bank rail. You may want to withdraw down on your card rail. But ultimately, you just want to make a payment, right? And you may want to do it to Perseus right now across this table, or you might want to do it to a merchant. And so it's about giving the consumer that choice. So that's the vision. We're obviously at different stages in different markets, but ultimately, what that's going to do is it's going to create a lot of different options and speed around doing things. And then the final one is remittances, because if you think about how difficult it still is to remit money and all the correspondent bank charges, that's a nightmare.
The examples you've given, they're all outside of Africa, but here we know that you and Visa have co-invested in companies like Paystack or Flutterwave. Is this the same strategy where you're kind of doubling down on people who are executing really well, and you're trying to eventually acquire them? If you can speak about that.
Yeah, so the companies I've talked about actually, though, are they're companies which we can take their capability into our network. So we bought a company called Transfast in December, which actually helps with remittances. So we have got a lot of stuff in Africa. What you would have seen is we took a stake in Jumia last year. And we also took a stake in Network International, which is a processing company. Everybody knows what Jumia is, right?
Yes. For the wrong reasons.
Yeah. So yeah, they're having a bit of a tough time. So and then Network International. Network International is a processing company, really big across Middle East Africa. So basically, what we're doing is payments has become very broad. It's become, if you talk to bankers, payments used to be something they didn't focus on. It was kind of like over here. Now payments is a big part of any banker's strategy because they realize that it's actually critical to get right. So what we're looking at is where are the companies that we can basically take into the Mastercard fold. But there's a bit of a but there. Those companies really have to be ones which you can take in. We don't like to innovate at the edge too much. So that's quite a corporate thing to say.
What does that mean, innovate at the edge?
So basically, we have back to that network. That basically, what we want to do is we want to be able to turn a switch and turn it on for every single institution around the world.
Okay.
And we want to be up. So if we bring in things at the edge, which are going to continue to be at the edge, that's not good. So things need to be fully integrated, and it needs to be done at kind of the right type of scale. So things need to be scalable. So if we buy something, our CEO, the next thing we know is we have a target. Go on, pay attention. How are we going to get this thing going? So I tell you, the Vocalink thing we bought in the UK. We are, there's a. I think it's okay to say there's an RFP process in South Africa right now. South Africa wants to modernize its payments infrastructure. A bank service said, we need help. We need to kind of go out. There's an RFP out right now. It's out. And so, that's okay. So we kind of there'll be bidders in there doing different types of things. And so we participate in those type of activities because the modernization of payments infrastructure is really critical.
How would have figured Mastercard is applying for these tenders? Because that's normally what the fintechs should be doing.
Yeah,
interesting.
I think that the reality is that we our skill is, I suppose, operating networks at its foundation, and so if we can help with infrastructure or we can help with modernization of infrastructure, we can. There's different levels. You have infrastructure, application, and then services, right? And we can play at any level of those three, depending on what the market need is. So back to your Zambian example, you could say that it might be any one of those different tiers.
Okay. I feel like I'm asking a lot of questions. There's a lot of fintechs. So to give you some context, Bongo Hive had a program with 5 fintechs. So I'm sure they'll have some questions for you. So we'll open up the room to questions. Yeah?
So you talked about financial inclusion and you talked about sort of 3 different elements: cash, mobile money, and then sort of electronic transactions. Now, particularly in Africa, we've seen a large growth in mobile money, and that means we've seen a large growth in telcos involved in this payment space. How is that presence and those slightly different competitors to what your conventional competitors are? How have you thought about that? Because their value add services are very different in the sense of you're building on this telco network, you're capable of including many additional things that potentially a Mastercard network would not be able to do. So what's your approach to that sort of new competitor that is pretty different to what you see in your more established markets?
Yes, I think it's a really interesting question, right? So because it's a phenomenon. So what you're seeing is you're seeing that a lot of people are quite taken by how successful the Chinese have been with the super apps. And the reason why that's really interesting is because people are realizing that it's less about how many accounts you have, it's more about eyeballs. How much time the eyeballs spend in your ecosystem. The longer they spend in your ecosystem, the more likely it is that they're going to buy something. So you need to have lots of interesting things in your shop window, and hopefully people will buy stuff, right? The question though is that if people are going to buy stuff, how are they going to buy? Okay, so if you think about the telco strategy is not to become a bank necessarily. The telco strategy is to have some sort of financial services underpinning strategy to enable things like streaming of online content, etc., etc. I don't know the telco strategy end to end, but it's kind of a starting point. And to that point, it could be around insurances, it could be around lending, it could be around a few other things. So the question then is, how do we feel about that? ultimately, at the end of the day, we're a B2B company or a B2B2C company. We're not a B2C company. So what that means is that we're happy to enable different players as they come through. I think the question is an interesting one, though, because it kind of is an interesting kind of dynamic between how the telco is going to actually roll out some of these strategies and ultimately what's their end game. And that's a totally different discussion, probably off camera.
Yeah.
But I think maybe I just wanted to add on the telco aspect that we've developed certain strategies of working with these telcos in a way that we've enabled them, and I think you should watch this space in Zambia. You're going to see some of the telcos are going now to have cards and VCN cards which are powered by Mastercard, if you like. So there's a lot that we're doing trying to work with these telcos.
Yeah, so we signed a deal which I think is announced around the Airtel, for example. Yeah. We had an opportunity to meet with Barclays Bank in the UK about a year ago, and what we heard was that they actually measure how many times an average customer goes into their app every month. Apparently, it's 40 times at the moment. 40 times, okay. And when they go into it, there's an average amount of time after logon of 267 seconds. So the customer's actually spending a decent amount of time, 40 times a month, in that ecosystem. The question, though, is how do you keep them coming back, and how do you actually make them buy stuff? And that's why things like open banking become quite interesting, because if the customer's then going to live in that ecosystem, how are other parties then going to get access into that ecosystem? And will they try and take you out? So how you navigate open banking within that new environment is fascinating.
What is open banking?
So open banking is effectively where you give access to a third party to information. So let's take an example. So as a bank you could actually say that the fintech has access to data to avail services. Mm-hmm. What's your definition?
No, same. But we haven't seen a lot of that here. Yeah. But we've seen people that played in the US kind of enabling fintechs to be able to connect to other banking apps.
So the reason why open banking took place in the UK was regulatory, right?
Yeah.
So it was around PSD2, which was brought in because people like Barclays, I don't know if you know this, but they had something like 70 different current accounts. And so the customer was confused. They were like, crazy, there's fees all over the place, there's lots of different CVPs. And so it became an issue because the banks weren't doing anything about it. They were just confusing the customer and making lots of money. So the regulator got pissed and came in and said, okay, we're going to have to do something about this. So they got regulated. So the point is actually rather to understand why the regulator might become heavy-handed, and are there things going on within the local ecosystem which could irritate a regulator over time, and actually then to do things proactively rather than being regulated. Yeah. So I actually think the question is, from a use case perspective, what are the use cases one can identify from an open banking perspective which you can just go after without regulation and to start moving on it? So I think there are elements of open banking probably in existence. They just aren't necessarily recognized. You'd be surprised, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm home again. Yeah, please.
Hi. I'm from Digital Vehicle. We had B2B switch, a local switch in the country. My interest is understanding how to get onto your rails for your global network. Do you have an initiative, or is there a program that you do for companies like Zazu and ourselves to get on board on your program?
So we obviously have a licensing and certification process that we take customers through, and so that's one thing. I'd say there's other things we do though, away from the kind of traditional onboarding of financial players. And so we run some pretty big fintech programs, for example. So if you've been through kind of first round funding, and you've got an interest of hooking up to our Start Path program, then actually you can go through a little bit of a process and try and get onto that program. And then it obviously has to have something to do with payments. And then actually the beauty of that is you then get socialized with, the big banks around the world. And the good thing about that is that if that's successful, then you get orders, right? And orders are obviously important because orders mean that you get more recognition and inflates your value. So that's the Start Path program. So I'm not sure which one's more relevant to you.
The Start Path program, is it open to people, fintechs, anywhere in the world?
Yeah.
Banks anywhere around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, you have to go through a little bit of a process just to make sure that it kind of makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a pretty cool program. I mean, we call these guys in and we get them to do pitches, sometimes at fairs, at conferences and stuff. And I mean, these guys are cutting edge stuff. And I was in Singapore about 3 months ago, and we were calling these guys in, and they were doing some really fantastic stuff around things like digital onboarding, right? How you can upload KYC documentation and process it real time. All the way through to how can you use AI to replace a chargeback environment. So it's all over the place, but it's cutting edge. Okay.
Yeah. Please.
Good evening, my name is Sanga. I have 2 questions.
Okay.
The first one is on cybersecurity. Apart from Mastercard 3D Secure, what else are you doing to tackle fraud in the e-commerce space, as well as contactless payments, let's say card readers and what information you can actually get from the contactless card?
Yeah.
The second one is more to do with both of you actually, in terms of the Zazu Mastercard enabled card. When will I receive my card?
I'll let Mark answer that.
Nice. So on the first one, so basically we 3D Secure is obviously a pretty clunky experience, right? I think we probably agree with that. So there's some optimization around that, and there's 3D Secure 2.0, which is now out and a lot less clunky, and everything else. I think the thing is that clunkiness and remembering passwords and I don't know about you, but I find it really painful, right? So I think the future of security, for one thing, has to be, and that's why biometrics have become interesting, it's because they're more in tune with who you are rather than something which happens at the end of a transaction. And plus, let's be honest, biometrics actually happens at the beginning of the transaction rather than a clunky password at the end of the transaction. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail around fraud and security because I'm worried I might have a few people falling asleep. But what I'd be happy to talk about with you separately is that we're looking at the entire flow within the transaction. Everything from when you make that authorization through to potentially a chargeback, and we're buying little companies and we're actually integrating them at different points of the transaction. It's fascinating. So the latest one we just bought was actually these guys will be able to, in your banking app, if you pull through the API, what they can do is you can actually look at your last transactions, for example, and you could say, I actually don't recognize that transaction. Now, ordinarily, when you look at that and you think like that, you're thinking, oh my God, long phone call to the call center, hideous kinds of amounts of explanations, probably a long time to resolve, etc. What this capability does is, and it can be pulled through into the banking app, is you can just double click on it and it gives you more information. So it tells you who made the transaction, what the merchant is, what the size was, what time of day it was, etc. So if it was your oldest son who borrowed your phone at a certain time to do something funky, you'd actually figure it out. But then if you weren't still happy, you can actually start a chargeback process through your phones at dispute. So what I'm saying is that we're getting very detailed in kind of the way that we think through how can we improve the customer experience but there's a lot of different opportunities there. Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, so we there's another company called New Data which we bought, which is quite amazing in the sense that in trying to demonstrate that at some point, the CEO had to put in the password, write it down, and ask someone to do the same, and it couldn't work. So it actually can detect how much pressure you apply on your phone, how you hold your phone, and a few other things before a transaction is accepted.
Yeah, so if I pass my phone to Perseus and I give him my password, this will detect the fact that Perseus is not marked, just the speed of typing, and so it's another example of another part of that stream. It's quite early, right?
What happens if you're drunk?
And you shouldn't be spending money because you'll make rash decisions.
But we've also seen you guys introduce cards with biometrics in other parts of the world.
Yeah, yeah. So we basically there's a pad where you can put your thumb. And that pad has captured your biometrics, and so when you dip, it kind of authenticates the payment. I think that's cool. Dan?
Yeah, hi Mark. I have a very
The Zazu question.
I didn't get the second.
Yeah.
The Zazu one?
Yeah.
Please.
Soon.
No, so a big part of what we've been doing with Mastercard's visit is obviously finalizing when the cards are going to be launched. So we've now got 33,000 cards in country. We've finished all of the testing activities, and barring one or two approvals, you all be Zazu card holders. So very soon.
Nice.
Sam, then.
So my question is, for Zambia, what is the strategy exactly? Like, I know Visa. I go to my bank, they give me a card, it's branded Visa, I can swipe. Like, from a consumer's perspective, do I expect to start seeing Mastercard cards in the market?
Similar.
Like, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, similar.
Like, what does Mastercard mean for me?
Yes, I think Mastercard will mean similar, but I think you'll probably see us in some different areas. So, for example, we signed a deal with NASCU, right? NASCU is the credit unions. It's a fascinating pain point where actually, people were going to the branches to withdraw cash and having to book an appointment to get to the branch to withdraw the cash, etc., 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 and often sitting on other people's balance sheets. So what we've done there is we've put in a debit Mastercard so that actually the cash can get paid to an account and you can make a payment. Yeah. So you're solving real pain points in really interesting areas. So I think the strategy we have is probably quite broad in terms of we're not focusing on the top 20%, we're focusing on the entire population. What you'll also see is that we've got a heavy acceptance focus. So you will see a proliferation of things like QR codes and cheaper, more inclusive forms of acceptance coming through. And then, look, I always open to kind of new innovative ideas. So I think if there's other collaborations which come out of it, then we're on for it. I think we also need to keep our brand alive. So we need to kind of be out there. We need to be present. So.
David?
Okay, my question is more towards the previous answer you gave. Historically, what used to happen is I'm a Barclays customer with a Mastercard, and I get to a shop or an ATM from a competing bank, say FNB, and I do a transaction, and something goes wrong with the transaction. Either the money doesn't come out, or the transaction is done twice on POS, for example. If I go to my bank and I say, I want to dispute this, they give you a form, you fill in the form, then you have to send away the form, and they tell you, this will take 10 working days. That's how long you used to wait until you get an answer, and then another week to get the funds.
45 days. Yeah.
How are they trying to address that? Because I know on the app you are saying you can do that.
But I think this is where companies like Zazu come into play, right? So if you think about some of the legacy issues that you're talking about, I mean, that's where companies like Zazu are going to come in, and they're just going to say there's different ways of doing things. If you look at banks like Monzo and Revolut and these type of companies in the UK, what they're doing is they're no longer thinking about a current account like a current account. They're looking at actually what are the needs of a customer. And the needs of a customer are, okay, I get 100 every month of salary, or whatever 100 is, right? Mm-hmm. Of that 100, some of that money needs to pay, things like my direct debit. So my direct debits need to clear. After my direct debits have cleared, ideally I need to kind of do some other things in the month, and then I ideally put something aside for savings. And so it's totally turning on its head. And actually, when you start to look at the way that people are building these new banks of the future, the technology stack actually supports that journey for the consumer. And so I think that's how those items will get addressed. And so the legacy banks will have to wake up and realize that people don't want to wait that long to get their things solved. Mastercard isn't going to solve that problem. Yeah, that's up to the bank.
Yeah?
My name is Perseus. So I've got, I think, 2 questions.
Okay.
So question number 1 is, how is Zazu going to address its distribution problem?
Mm-hmm.
I think I know Zazu and Mastercard, and I do not know where to deposit money aside. So I think it's back or here.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you going to address the distribution of agents?
Yeah.
And then I have another question. Because it's Mastercard, and you said you are working with other banks to have Mastercard on there. So can I get my Zazu card and go to Zanaco ATM and withdraw money?
Mm-hmm. So when we were testing from the end of November, we managed to test the Zazu card on over 8 ATMs from different banks, and were able to withdraw money and have the notifications come through in the app. In terms of distribution, we can't disclose right now, but we're in high-level talks with about 2 retailers who've got quite a wide presence across Zambia. So what that means is you'll be able to go to any of their shops and say, I'm here on behalf of Zazu, I want to get my card, and they'll give you that card. So that means we don't have to send it to you because it's quite difficult. In terms of depositing money, you can currently do that using one of 4 ways. The first one, if you are a tourist and you've just arrived and you want to transfer money from your foreign bank account, you put your debit card number using the gateway that we have in the app. Then we transfer money from your originating account into Zazu. You can also use MTN money, so you put your phone number and then it pops up. So you put your PIN number and then we'll pull money from your MTN mobile money. We're working on the likes of Airtel and Samtel, but it's going to take some time. We're also partnering with people like Zona using their agents. So you can go to any of their Zona outlets and you give them 500 kwacha, then it instantly appears in your Zazu wallet. And then the last one is to use EFT transfer. So that one is instant as well. But there'll be more of these partnerships coming through, like people like Paygo, who we do not own despite having the same color scheme. So if they're able to integrate into all of the MNOs, then we could potentially integrate into them. But that is a huge dependent on them changing the colors. Yeah.
Zazu is an app, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of the users, mobile money, anything in this country,
Yeah.
are using USSD. So how are you going to address
Mm. Yeah, so Zazu is 2 things. It's an app and the card. So if you're using the app, you obviously have a smartphone. But the first product that we developed was actually a USSD educational platform. So teaching people how to use financial services. And that has been used by over 1 million people in Zambia. So we've got some experience on building a USSD. And we're now starting to tailor that towards reading the data on the card. So you can use USSD. So in the next few months, you'll be able to use USSD for your Zazu transactions. Yeah.
Actually, just compliment answer. We will integrate with Zazu at some point. Our platform is more user features, so we will be able to take deposits from us.
Okay, 2 more questions, yeah?
Sorry, I have another follow-up question. So if someone, so like you've already mentioned some of the great products you have, good biometric cards, and someone who's interested in some of those value propositions, a small company in Zambia, how do they get to you? Do we have to go through like an already existing partner like Zazu? How does that work?
Yeah.
If we've noticed some products that we feel okay can work in certain use case.
Go through FI, financial institutions.
So then go through Zazu.
If I can tag on to that
Yeah.
one, is so I work for Bomba High, and we support people who are innovating or coming up with solving problems, like say around the edge. And so they'll most likely need to go through, it works easier for them instead of them building a stack again, is to connect to your stack and be able to connect at various levels and see if that can enable them to deliver their solutions or provide what they're trying to do. And we'll be keen in having a conversation around how we could work together to either provide the education and support to enable what they're trying to do and use your infrastructure to be able to get.
So one thing you can do if you wanted to get detailed very quickly is you can go onto the Mastercard developer zone, and all of our APIs specs are written out in full detail, in very easy to read English, down to some very complicated stuff. But there's full transparency of everything we've got on that.
Okay.
But that would be a starting point.
Yeah.
Sorry, mine is a bit futuristic. I was just thinking, you said globally we've only managed to displace cash, about 15%.
Yeah. And by the way, it was the same number 10 years ago.
Yeah, so and trying to be around what, 70 years, right? Give or take 1950. So I'm just thinking, do we have any other strategies to displace cash apart from card? Are we thinking of evolving that space into something else?
Hopefully
not too soon. I'm launching my head.
Let's your business idea.
Let's thrive first. Look, I think we probably have got enough to work with right now. There's lots of big ideas out there like crypto and all these other kinds of things. The reality is though it's not actually all of us who can solve all the problems. We do need government to get a lot more involved. So where we can talk about flexing economics and all this other kind of stuff, policy is really important. Establishing a regulatory environment which actually allows us to succeed is not always done as quickly. I mean, you talk about things like a person-to-person payment, a person-to-merchant payment, and these type of things. Actually, you need to have a regulatory framework in order for that to thrive. So I think before we've got to the end of this chapter, we need to get the regulatory frameworks in place, and that's it to do on my side.
One more question before we finish. Somebody who hasn't spoken at the back.
Good call.
So I came to everyone's name, but I have a question. Last year I started working at a proposal doing payment processing. I approached a central bank and they liked the idea. And initially had briefly discussed for a few minutes was integrating into the current systems that we have. So my question was interested in general fintech. How easy is it to integrate new fintech startup into an already existing tooling system that's set up? Zambia, Indo, the same as someone asking about. Standard comes already integrated, something like that.
How easy is it to integrate into existing fintechs?
Yes, as a start.
I think it depends on who you're speaking with. Yeah, we've had different experiences. I obviously can't say which names, but some people have just outright said no to us, and some people have approached us. So you get very different use cases. I think it also depends on what value you're offering to them. So if it's quite clear, then they'll come to you, right? Yeah. I don't know. Maybe you can speak to Digital Paygo. They can give you their view. Yeah. All right. The very last one. Yeah. Sango, what's your question?
Okay, my question is to do with maybe just an enhanced product. Are you thinking of going something in the lines of Apple Pay, Google Pay? Because I know card is still there for a while, but if you could offer something that mimics like a virtual card, then you have different devices, maybe a smartwatch or smartphone, where you have an app where you can pay for.
Before you answer that one, what's your question?
What's your plan for the rural customer?
What's our plan for the rural customer? All right. So what we've done, obviously, we've taught 1 million people who are quite rural, and we understand where where they're located, and what financial services they're looking for. We taught them about insurance, about saving money, about loans. So we can't exactly break it down, but it is something that is part of our roadmap because there's nobody who's really focusing on that. So over the next few months, we'll start to execute on some of those plans. And then the last one, Mike really has to go, so...
Yeah, so I think, the Apple Card is underwritten by
JP?
Goldman Sachs, right? And that's a Mastercard, which is cool. So I think it's up to the banks to kind of come up with these new types, or retailers or whatever, to come up with these new types of ideas. What I can tell you is there's going to be a long tail. So cards aren't going anywhere too quickly. This is long tail, but it's exciting. I mean, my brother is a fitness enthusiast, and so he's telling me, he's got a Monzo card, but he really doesn't want the card because he's out running. So he just wants to be able to pay wherever he goes, and so he's got a Garmin watch, and his Garmin wearable just basically is what he uses for everything now. So it's kind of very much about who he is and what he is and what he wants. So I think it's an exciting time to be in payments. Very thrilled to be working with Zazu. I think we need to see more companies like Zazu who are trying to break the boundaries. We have a company called Bank Zero in South Africa who's trying to do something quite similar. It's an exciting time. And it's going to test a lot of people. It's going to test some of these legacy problems. So it's going to make a lot of people wake up. It's going to be fun.
Thank you guys so much for coming through tonight. There's drinks, there's food in there. If you want to get more details about Zazu, obviously me. If you want more details about Mastercard, then you can leave. But Vincent and Mike, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Yeah.